All right. Welcome, everybody, to tonight's Wireside chat. I'm Paul Witcover, the Associate Dean of the Online MFA, and we are here with my co-host, Melissa Hart, who is unfortunately incommunicado today due to a bad case of laryngitis. And our special guest tonight, Tom Deady. And I'm going to do a brief introduction of Tom here. So bear with me, please. Tom Deady's 2016 debut novel, Haven, won the Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement in a First Novel. He has since published several novels and novellas inspired by his love of horror, including most recently the novel Eternal Darkness, which earned comparisons to Stephen King. Tom was born and raised in Massachusetts, not far from the historic town of Salem, which might explain his love of horror. He resides in Arizona, which I suppose has his own share of historical horrors, where he's working on his next novel and teaches in the BA Creative Writing program here at SNHU. And maybe even some of your students are here, Tom. It's possible.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Yeah, I hope some of my students are here. That would be fun.
So I'm going to just address the elephant in the room immediately by asking you about your shirt.
This is my Haunting of Hill House shirt. I'm a big Shirley Jackson fan, one of the classics. I first learned of her work through her short story, The Lottery, and then began devouring everything else she's written. In the fiction realm, at least. I know she has some nonfiction books about raising her kids and things like that. I have not read those, but big fan of her work.
Yeah, she also has a collection that contains some of her thoughts about the writing process and writing horror and just writing fiction in general, which I found to be extremely useful. And I think I know where it is in my bookshelf. So give me 1 second. I'll see if I can grab it. Do I actually know where it is? I saw it here the other day. Oh gosh, where is it? Here it is. Shirley Jackson, Come Along With Me.
Oh yeah, I have not read that one either.
Highly recommended. I think there might be some fiction in here too, by the way. But yeah, she's a wonderful writer.
Yeah, I'm always inspired to hear people's stories of, how they got started and thoughts on where they get their ideas and all that stuff. I love that kind of work.
Yep. And I am going to pose those same questions to you. Before I do, I want to let everyone know that if you have a question for Tom or me or anyone at all, just type it into the chat and we will see it there and we will surface it and we will answer it to the best of our ability. So, Tom, what about your journey as a writer, your journey to become an instructor at SNHU? If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about all that.
Sure. So it's kind of funny in a sad way, I guess, that I knew when I was a kid I really wanted to be a writer. I grew up stealing my brother's Hardy Boys books, and then I found this other series that was very similar when I was a kid called Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators.
Oh, I loved Alfred Hitchcock and
the Three Investigators. I still have all my original hardcovers. And I always loved the ones that kind of bent towards the supernatural, even though at the end it turned out it wasn't anything supernatural.
Yeah, Scooby-Doo was very much, I think, influenced by Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators.
Yep, Scooby-Doo was another one of my childhood favorites. And then, so when I was about 13, I was out at the local Woolworths. If anybody remembers Woolworth, it used to be like a little department store kind of before they had big box stores like they do now. And they had those little black spinny racks with all the paperbacks on them. And I'm looking for a new book, and I find this cool book. I wish I had it with me. It was an all black cover with just one drop of red on it. And of course, it was the original Salem's Lot paperback by Stephen King. And I took that home and devoured it. And that was it. I was hooked.
That was it.
I was a horror guy for life.
So you were bitten by Stephen King, as it were.
Yeah, very well done. Very well done. So coincidentally, not long after that, in whatever year that was in school, we had to write, a creative writing, a short story, and I wrote a vampire story, of course. And I'll never forget my English teacher writing on top of the paper when she handed it back. This is great. We should put it in Boojum Rock. Boojum Rock was our high school like literary magazine. And
A
of course,
little nod to Lewis Carroll there.
I don't know where the name came from, if I'm being honest. I never bothered to look it up either. Is that what that's from?
Well, the Boojum is from The Hunting of the Snark, Lewis Carroll poem.
Interesting. So, of course, me being this, introverted, nerdy teenager said, I can't put it there. Everybody will read it. Like, I don't want that. I'm already like on the bottom of the food chain here. I don't need to be weirder. So I just, I never followed up. And then I ended up going to college and pursuing a whole, high-tech career, which I've endured my whole career. And while writing is always what I wanted to do, I'd go back to it every once in a while, and then like life would get in the way. And there was a point, I don't know if you guys remember Writer's Digest magazine. I'm not sure if it's even if magazines exist anymore, but they had a mail order back when there was no internet. This was legit snail mail writing class. And I signed up for it, and I started taking this class with Michael Garrett, who's a pretty well-known editor, or was in the horror genre. He edited a bunch of books called the Hot-Blooded series, and I started this journey on the mail order, novel writing course, and it's where I started writing Haven, and that was back in like 1995 or so. And I would get into it for a while, and then I had two daughters, and I had two jobs, and I had I'd put it away for years, and I'd get the bug again and take it out, and write a few more chapters, and then whatever would happen. So Haven actually took me about 15 years to write. I finished it in about 2010, and I said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to really give it a shot this time. So I finished the book. And my buddy and I had been blogging about the Red Sox back when blogs were cool. So back in 2004, we blogged the entire Red Sox season, and we had a pretty good following. Like blogs were, like I said, blogs were still kind of cool back then, and a lot of people followed them. It was before there was like really Facebook or anything else. So people would find their interest and find the blogs they liked about them and kind of latch onto them. So we had a pretty big following. So at the end of the 2004 season, when the Red Sox won the World Series, my buddy and I said, we have a book here in, game by game chapter form. Let's see if we can get it published. So we did. And at the same time, this guy named Stephen King and Stuart Onan did the same thing in their book Faithful.
Oh,
and
gosh.
Kind of overshadowed us anyway. But the cool thing was Stuart Onan's publicist reached out to us because we had such a big following and said, can you interview Stuart for the Faithful book? And we said, sure. And so I got him on the phone, and we interviewed, and I kind of stayed in touch with him because I was a big fan of his fiction work. He used to write in the, I guess, horror adjacent genre. He had Songs of the Missing, and I think it was called The Night Road. Some sort of ghost story type, horror type thing. So I kind of like stayed in touch with them, and we just chatted via email occasionally, talking about baseball and books and stuff. And finally, when Haven was done, I screwed up all my courage and said, listen, Stuart, I've been writing this book for like 15 years. How about you read it? So I sent him a physical copy of the manuscript. And Haven's a big book. So Haven's a 500-page
Oh, yeah. Wow.
book. So I sent him this, printed out manuscript. Not only did he read it, he basically line edited the entire thing for me and gave me a blurb for it.
Fantastic.
And I was blown away. And coincidentally, right about the same time, I don't know if you're familiar with Cemetery Dance magazine.
Sure.
And they also do a lot of limited edition hardcover books by Stephen King and other. It's basically a horror boutique almost, I guess, but it's a little bigger than that. They had an open call, which they never have. And I said, I'm going to throw Haven at them and, see what happened. And I had Stuart's blurb. And to this day, I believe it's his blurb that is why it caught Cemetery Dance's eye, because they had worked with Stuart before. So Richard Chismar reached out and said, hey, I had sent like the first 3 chapters. He said, I want to read the whole thing. And here I am, like, kind of starry-eyed and fanboying about Cemetery Dance reading my book. And then a couple of years later, they put it out as a limited edition hardcover and ebook, and it went on to win the Bram Stoker Award, which is still surreal to me. I still can't believe any of it happened. And that was it. Like I said, that's it. This is what I'm going to do. I went back to SNHU and got my master's in English and creative writing, and have been writing pretty much nonstop.
I did not know that. That's really interesting. Yeah. You're an alum of our program.
I am.
Well, yes, that's fantastic. That is awesome. So, I mean, that must have been, I mean, you mentioned that it was like a surreal experience, but I can only imagine like your first novel comes out through kind of a unlikely chain of events. And then on top of it all, you win probably the most prestigious award in the horror community.
Yeah, the event that year, they changed the event for where they have their awards banquet every year. That year it was on the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California, which was an amazing venue for the event. And since I was on the ballot, I flew my 2 adult daughters out. I wanted them with me just in case, never expecting to win. And I bumped into somebody, I can't remember who it was, and they're like, do you have your speech ready for tonight? And I'm like, no, like, why would I? And they're like, well, there's only 5 names on the list. Like, you should probably have a speech just in case. Like, they weren't telling me I won. It wasn't somebody that was in the know or anything. They're just like, you don't want to get up there and not know what you're going to say. So I'm like, that's probably a good idea. So I went and wrote a speech, and I'll never forget just sitting there as they're going through all the awards and just waiting and just feeling sick to my stomach. And because even though I didn't expect it, I knew I was going to be really disappointed.
Right.
And they called my name, and I got up, and my oldest daughter like latched onto me because she knew how much it meant to me. And I'm like, 5 minutes later, she's still hugging me. I'm like, they're waiting for me up there. I got to go up there. And it was just such an amazing, amazing moment. And it's something I'll never forget.
That sounds great. What a great moment for you and for your family.
Yeah.
I mean, that realization of a lifelong dream.
Yeah, the funny part is, like, I'm thinking to myself, like, this is it. Like, I'm quitting my day job, and here I go. I'm gonna have agents and producers kicking my door down for books and movies, and it doesn't really work that way, but it was still cool.
Right. So just because I know a lot of the people that are listening here tonight, like, students who are aspiring writers who would not mind achieving the kind of success that you have achieved. What happened between the time that you sold that first book and it wins this prestigious award, and you have all of these kind of fantasies about, well, it's going to be optioned for the movies and it'll be made into a movie or miniseries, whatever. What happens, between the realization that, oh gosh, that's not going to happen this time, and how do you go on from that? What comes after that?
For me, I mean, for me, I just keep writing. Like, once I got that bug and I knew I could do it to a point where people would actually read what I wrote, that was all I needed. Even if Cemetery Dance didn't publish the book, or as long as somebody did, I guess, I would have felt validated if it didn't win the award. I think I just needed that boost of confidence to say, like, other than somebody with the same last name as me telling me like, this doesn't suck, you should keep doing this. So, so for me, it would have been a nice thing to have the Netflix series or whatever. But for me, I really do love the writing. I know it sounds like a cliche, but I do love telling stories.
And I did a little research on your work before our talk tonight, and I see that you have been publishing a lot of, you've published a few novels, including the one that I just mentioned, which was, interestingly enough, not just compared to Stephen King, but also compared to Salem's Lot in some respects. But also I see that you've published a lot of novellas.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your publishing path, and also what is it about novellas that seems to be a good length for you for whatever reason?
I'll tell you why. After some thought, I think the reason it's a good length for me is because I'm terrible at writing short stories, and they always go way too long, so they become novellas. A lot of them I intended to start out writing a short story, and it just I've never been good at short stories because when I grew up reading horror in the 80s, like late 70s and 80s, every book was 500 to 1,000 pages. They were these massive doorstops that had this amazing cast of characters and a bunch of different subplots and all the backstory of all the and I just love that. I love all the detail of setting and character, and that's what I find myself doing. Even when I'm trying to write a short story, I'm like, but the reader has to know this and about this character, and they get longer than the typical short story and become novellas. So it is, for me, it's a media that I can get all the backstory and all the the character development that I want without and still tell the story in sort of a short amount of time without it being 500 pages. So it has worked out great. I'll put out a bunch of novellas, and I do enjoy that length.
Yeah, I think that's a length that many writers enjoy, but it hasn't been until the advent of the internet and ebooks and self-publishing that it's become kind of a financially viable
Exactly.
form, because up until then a magazine would be loath to publish a novella because it would take up so much real estate, unless it was by a name who would really help to sell the magazine.
I totally agree. Yeah, it's a good length, but it's a hard length to sell. I recently sold a novella to Cemetery Dance, coincidentally. It'd be my second publication with them. It's a weird Western that's coming out next year that I'm really excited about. They accepted it, but then they reached out to me and said, we love the story, and it's their novella series. They have a novella series there. They said, but it's on the short side of the novel. I think it was only like 18,000 words. Like it's like you said, it's not really viable to put out a book of that length. They're like, do you have another story we can like throw in with it? And I'm like, I would love to write another story in that same world with some crossover characters. So I wrote a second novella for them. So that's going to come out in I think November of next year.
So that'll be bundled as a single volume?
It'll be a single volume with two essentially standalone novellas, but that are tied together by setting and character. But the stories themselves, you don't need one to read the other. But
yeah.
The
you have a title?
It is tentative. The first story was called A Blade to Silence the Screams, and I believe that will be the book's title. The name of the fictional town is Sundown, Arizona, and the second story is called After Sundown. It continues on the first one. So yeah, I've always been a big fan of American Southwest. Even before I moved there, I had been visiting there for 10 years or so, and it's just such a different world and such a different history than what we're used to on the East Coast that it's just an endless well for ideas out here.
So I'd like to remind our listeners or viewers that if you have a question, please don't be shy and post it in the chat. I promise we'll do our best to answer. So let me ask you, we've talked about Shirley Jackson, we've talked about Stephen King. What other writers have influenced you? And it doesn't necessarily have to be from the horror genre.
So specific to horror, again, when I used to go to the bookstores in the 80s, they had these, it was like the golden era of horror. They had,
that was the big horror boom.
They had a whole horror section, which it's hard to find now, but there was King, there was Dean Koontz, Robert McCammon, Peter Straub, Dan Simmons to a point, were my kind of my staples in horror. For more mainstream literature, I'm honestly a big fan of all the stuff that I probably didn't enjoy reading in high school, but going back and revisiting it as an adult is much more satisfying. To Kill a Mockingbird is my favorite book of all time, bar none. Of Mice and Men, Ethan Frome. There's a lot of just, it was just such a different time frame that those were written in. I can get lost in those worlds without technology and without, all the stress of modern day. I just love those kind of stories.
Do you set your own stories in a kind of a an era prior to our own?
Well, I shouldn't say a lot of my stories are set in the time period that I grew up. So they're set in like 70s and 80s, which is, pre-cell phone and pre-GPS. And it technology makes horror difficult unless you use the technology to your advantage somehow. The horror relies on, in a lot of the subtropes, it relies on isolation, and it's impossible in the modern era to isolate anyone. I'm lost. I have a flashlight. I have a GPS. I have a phone. I have everything I need at my fingertips. There's like, it's, and then if you do that and you say, you see the guy holding up the phone in all the horror movies, like, oh, I don't have signal. Well, isn't that convenient? You have signal everywhere in the world, but you don't have signal. And it just seems so cliche to try to make that work in the modern day. So the other reason I do it is because a lot of my work has a very much like a coming of age feel. There's a lot of, young adult protagonists and characters. And I don't know, I'm very nostalgic about my own childhood. So I tend to write it in the time that I grew up because I know so much about what it was like to grow up then. I can't even imagine what it's like to grow up here and now in this world. So it's hard for me to write about it.
Right. I noticed that you have written some YA horror.
Yes.
So what is the dividing line between YA horror and a horror novel that would any novel that has a protagonist who's, say, 17 years old, would that novel automatically be a YA novel, or are there other markers that determine what a novel is going to be?
If you find the real answer to that question, please let me know, because I don't know what it is. I do know between middle grade and YA, it's just sex. That's it.
Yeah.
Like you can, and I guess swear. You can't really swear in middle grade either. But between YA and adult, it's a very gray line. Like a lot of people would say Haven would have qualified as a YA novel. I mean, there's obviously a lot of violence and there's a lot of swear words, but because of the age of the protagonist is what drives it to potentially fit in that YA category. Right. So,
that might be a little long, although maybe not.
True.
At this point.
But then look at Harry Potter, right?
Well, that's what I was just thinking. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So my official YA book is called The Clearing, and I wrote that specifically for my two daughters. When my daughters were little, we used to read, we'd read like The Babysitter's Club and all that type of stuff. And as soon as you get into the more YA, not the, you know, the children's stuff, but into the YA stuff like Harry Potter, they both loved Harry Potter, and I'm like, that's great, but why is, you know, it's always a male protagonist in those books. So I wrote The Clearing with two, you know, 13-year-old protagonists specifically because I wanted to write the book that I wanted my daughters to read when they were that age that didn't exist. So that's why
awesome. I guess that was Toni Morrison said, like, write the book that you want to read or that you think should be written. Nobody else can write it but you.
Right.
So I'm going to get a couple of questions out of the chat.
Okay.
The first one here is, what was the most challenging part of the SNHU creative writing program for you?
Probably I think the most difficult class in that master's program was probably the advanced writing workshop. That was some pretty intensive stuff, and you know, it was, the instructor I had was fairly critical. I mean, it's hard for anybody to hear their work critiqued, I guess, and especially if it's somebody. So let me fast forward. Like today, I'll send out my work to you know, friends that are in the genre, other writers and things like that. And I feel like they kind of know where I'm trying to go to because they have like minds in terms of what they like to read. And when I was writing for the advanced writing workshop, I mean, it could have been a mystery specific person that was the instructor, or any other, you know, fiction category, right? So not everybody thinks of horror in the same light as they do other genres. It's kind of like the redheaded stepchild thing in as a subgenre in fiction sometimes. So it was hard for me to hear criticism and not be sure that that criticism was coming from someone who's read a lot of that type of stuff or not. So I struggled a bit with that class, but again, it's every piece of criticism, there's always something you can take away from it, whether it's, you know, meant to be constructive or whether it's mean-spirited. There's always a nugget of truth in there that as a writer you can take that and learn and grow from it. So I try to keep that attitude throughout.
How do you develop that attitude?
It's not easy, you know. It Bad reviews and bad criticisms, they hurt, but you kind of get used to it, and you just kind of have to just. It's part of the business, right? Like you have to be able to. If you can't deal with that, then you're not. You know, Stephen King gets bad reviews. Everybody gets bad reviews. You're gonna, and you know, it's actually kind of really edgy these days to kind of make fun of Stephen King's writing for some reason. I don't know. But in a lot of forums I see on social media, people are just like slamming him. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure he doesn't care about your little criticism sitting in his mansions and all that. But it does take time. I mean, the first few times it happens, it really leaves a wound, and it leaves you questioning, you know, your ability to write and whether or not you should continue. It can be really hard and devastating, and you just have to, hopefully you have a good enough support system around you to, you know, help you shake it off, because writing is, it's such a solitary thing. You're sitting there after everyone else is in bed or whatever your time of the day to write is, and you're by yourself, and it's very solitary. And then when you finally have the courage to put your stuff out there and somebody throws it back in your face and tells you it sucks, it does hurt. I'm not going to lie. I mean, to all the students listening out there, getting that thick skin, I mean, it's, you got to develop that scar tissue and just kind of learn to let it roll off you. And everybody, all the more established writers will say, don't read your reviews. But how can you not read your reviews? Like, you have to go read your reviews. You want to know what people think of your work. And sometimes I wished I hadn't, but yeah, it's, I don't have a real, you know, earth-shattering secret on how to develop that attitude, but you just have to have a good support system around you to help you keep going sometimes.
Yeah, I know that, back when I was in writing workshops and kind of learning my craft and everything, there really was no attention paid to that support system that you're talking about, and that some people in the chat are mentioning. It was more like, we're going to toughen you up, kid. We're
Yeah,
going to make sure that you get a tough skin so you can deal with anything that's coming to you in the outside world is going to be 100 times worse than what you experience in this workshop. So get over yourself.
right.
And that was an approach that I feel was not really all that beneficial to anyone. So I
Yeah.
mean, I know in the MFA, we've tried to structure things in such a way that the workshops really are, grounded in a philosophy of support and positivity. And I mentioned that only because I don't want anybody who's listening, and thinking about, gee, maybe I'll go get my MA or my MFA, and hearing some of these stories and thinking like, oh, maybe not. No, we're a very
Oh,
welcoming
that,
environment, and we hope everybody comes in.
yeah, my comment was in no way a reflection of a bad experience with a teacher. It was my personal internal struggle with trying to write for that workshop. It had nothing to do with the curriculum or the instructor at all. I want to make sure that's clear.
No, that was. I didn't mean
What
to imply that.
a lot of what writers struggle with is right there and nowhere else.
Yep, that's right. Exactly. The mind plays tricks, you play tricks back, as Pee
Exactly.
Wee once said. So let me go back into the chat here.
Sure.
What inspires you to create your next novel?
I I see a lot of people posting or are talking about writer's block, and I don't know if it's because I was like a frustrated writer my whole life. I didn't publish a book till I was in my 50s. I have no shortage of ideas. I can find inspiration and ideas just everywhere I look. I wrote a story. One example I use, I was driving, this was back when I still lived in Massachusetts. I was driving home, and it was one of those like late winter freezing rainstorm kind of things where it's like it's not really pretty snow. It's just like this slushy mess that makes the roads all filled with black ice. I'm driving home from my day job, and it's dark and miserable. And I'm driving by this little strip mall, and they must have been having some kind of grand opening or something like that because they had all these balloons at the entrance to the strip mall. But at the same time, there had been some type of accidents because of the road, and there was an ambulance there, and just the lights reflecting off the balloons was such a dichotomy to me that I'm like, something is supposed to be celebratory is now not. And I came up with this story called The Pink Balloon, which ended up being published in God, I can't remember which anthology it was, but I don't know. That where do you get your ideas and inspiration? I think unfortunately is different for everyone. But another story that I just finished, and I'm still involved in a writing group with a bunch of my friends, and I just had them critique it for me. I was recently back in Massachusetts visiting, and you know how when there's an accident or a death on the road, they usually have like sometimes they'll put a memorial with crosses and flowers and things. So I was staying in Ipswich, Mass, with my in-laws, and I passed by one of those, but it was a bicycle. And I assume the kid probably got hit on his bike. Well, and I'm like a whole story just came into my head just by seeing that one thing. So
Yeah.
I don't know how it works for other people, but I have maybe some really weird triggers that like I see something and it just triggers a what if type of story for me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a way it becomes kind of a habit almost that what elements are going to trigger that kind of reaction in you, right? So you can, when you see them, you're prepared to generate a story from them.
Yeah, and to be honest, I do a lot of things that kind of foster that as well. So I mentioned at the beginning, my weird background here is I'm in an RV right now. My wife and I about 2 years ago bought an RV, and we kind of drive everywhere, and I drive specifically to places that have like weird history or haunted or abandoned asylums or prisons. And so I go to places that are definitely gonna like help that trigger go off in my head. So
it must be interesting when you and your wife are planning your next vacation. You're probably like, well, honey, I've got a couple of interesting choices here. Where, I mean, is she on board with all of your journeys?
To go back to the support system, she is my biggest supporter, and you know, she does all these crazy things with me. We spent the night in Waverly Hills Asylum in Kentucky. It's an old it was originally a tuberculosis not asylum, but hospital. And then when that was over, they converted it to an asylum. And it's this giant, foreboding looking brick building, and it's just completely abandoned. There's no electricity, and this tour company just takes you in there, and you walk around with flashlights, and they tell you all the weird history of the things that happened there. We've been to the Stanley Hotel, which is where Stephen King stayed when he got the idea for The Shining, which is allegedly haunted as well. My problem is with all this, I don't ever experience that. I don't have whatever it takes to like let the ghosts in or whatever. So I don't ever feel any of the supernatural stuff. Coincidentally, my wife does. Like, she'll walk into a room in one of these places and be like, something happened here, and then the tour guide will come in and tell us what happened. So I guess I lucked out that she has that, and she kind of believes in this stuff, and it's not as there's not as much suspension of disbelief when she reads my stories as there might have been for someone else. So yeah, she's the perfect partner in crime for me.
She's got a bit of The Shining, it sounds like.
A bit of something, yeah, which works for me. So
yeah,
we've been to a lot of cool places. There's such wild history out there that you never hear about. It's crazy.
Let me circle back to you mentioned the writers workshop that or writers group that you're still involved with some of your friends. Are those like other professional writers?
It's a mix. There are some professional that if you're in the horror genre, you'd know. Krista Carmen is in the group. She just wrote a book called The Daughters of Block Island that's getting a lot of really positive press right now. But then there's other people in there that are, you know, just aspiring, and you know, they're getting a few short stories out there here and there, and they're just waiting for their, you know, next big break too. So it's kind of it's a good mix of people to get feedback from, and it's funny. It actually, a lot of the people in that group started back when I originally did that first trip to the Stanley Hotel, which was back in like 2015. They had a writing retreat out there, and you know, again, I was brand new. Haven wasn't even out yet. I didn't really have any publishing credits. I was waiting for Haven to be published. And Josh Mallerman was the guest of honor back right after Bird Box came out. He hadn't even caught on yet. Nobody knew who he was. Jack Ketchum was there before he passed. So if you're in the horror world, Jack Ketchum wrote The Girl Next Door, and is probably his most famous one. Red is another one. He was like a superstar back in the 80s in the horror genre. And they were there giving writing workshops and things like that. Fast forward a couple of years, when I start going to conventions like Stoker Con and other horror themed conventions, I keep bumping into all these people. They're like, yeah, I was at this thing at the Stanley. And I'm like, well, I was there too. How did I not? And I go back and start looking through all my pictures, and I see these people in the background that I never even talked to at the event. So coincidentally, a lot of the people, I think they started that writing group at some point after that event, and I just didn't join it until maybe a couple of years ago. Because again, writing groups are another, for the aspiring writers out there, writing groups are great, but you have to kind of find your people. There's a lot of writing groups out there that I know from speaking to friends that people come and go, and you just don't find that connection. This group is great. We give each other, hard criticism, but good criticism. And so for any aspiring folks out there, I would say, if you've been to a writing group and it wasn't for you, try another one. And if you haven't been to one, try one, because it's a good, safe place for you to start getting your work in front of people, again, who don't share your last name and are just going to tell you it's great no matter if it is or not. So
Right. And I mean, I would add to that if you're in the MA program or the MFA program now, or even if you're studying in the BA, look to your peers and make connections now with people who might well be important to your writing life and your personal life for many years yet to come.
Sorry, Paul, to interrupt.
No, please go ahead.
It's a great point I wanted to make that I forgot to mention, is when I was taking these classes at SNHU for my master's, I did exactly that. A bunch of us started talking offline, and we ended up writing and publishing an anthology with just majority of it was ex or still SNHU students, and it's called Shades of Fear. It's probably still out there because it was kind of self-published on Amazon.
That is so cool.
I had some ties with the Jimmy Fund Clinic back in Boston, and when we published it, we made it all proceeds go to the Jimmy Fund Clinic, and I'm sure they still do if anybody's out there still buying it. I mean, it's probably so far down in the Amazon ranks, but it came out in when I was still a student there in 2015 or so, and it was a great experience collaborating with other students who had just been through kind of the same classes and the same experience at SNHU, and I thought we put out a pretty cool anthology.
So you have experience both through being published in a traditional manner, but also self-publishing.
Yes.
Your work. So can you talk a little bit about how do you make the decision as to which route you're going to take for a particular book?
So when I first started out, I would have been happy to accept any offer from any publisher, because that's just how I don't know how it is, I guess. I felt like anybody that wanted to publish me, I should be happy about it and let them publish me. And it worked out. I worked with a lot of great publishers, indie presses like Cemetery Dance, Bloodshot Books, Crystal Lake Publishing. There's been a bunch of them. I've never really stuck with one publisher. And when Haven came out, the weird thing about Haven coming out from Cemetery Dance was they did the limited edition hardcover, and that was limited to 750 copies. And when that sold out, it was gone, and they had the ebook. And then I started going to conventions and getting a dealer's table, and I'm like, I don't have copies of Haven to sell because it was limited edition. So I self-published the paperback copy, and that was my first venture into self-publishing. And I also went out and figured out how to have the audiobook done. And then, so I went through all these different indie publishers and stuff, and I kind of evaluate, some of them are great. They give you a great cover. They do editing for you. They do some marketing for you. Others aren't so great at any of that. And they're kind of you're just another horse in their stable, and maybe they're waiting for one of their horses to hit it big. And so they go by volume and cast a wide net, but don't really do the little things that help you as an author, like the editing and the marketing. Specifically, the marketing is brutal out there. So recently, a couple of my indie publishers actually went out of business, which is another common thing in indie publishing. It's just not it's not a get rich quick scheme, and a lot of people might think it is. So when those books were basically off the market, I took the rights back, which we can talk about contracts for hours if you want, but make sure you can get your rights back if you need to. I took my rights back, and instead of trying to shop around for a new publisher, I self-published them myself. And I will say again to the students and aspiring writers out there, marketing is a big part of writing these days. It's not like it was in the old days where you send your book out, the publisher does everything, and the next thing you know, it's in all the bookstores and airports and everywhere. It doesn't work like that anymore. And what I found with self-publishing is I can do a lot more creative marketing and know immediately if those promotions or whatever they are, advertisements, are working or not. Where if my book is with even an indie publisher, I don't have access to those like real-time stats to say, okay, on November 11th, I ran this ad, and on November 11th, I had 100 new sales. It worked. Indie publishers don't really give you that. So what I found is self-publishing for me, now that I'm trying to figure out the marketing side of it more, is probably a direction I'm going to go. And I had a literary agent who I fired recently because unless they're getting you into one of the big five publishers, they're not going to do a lot for you. Or if they have the Hollywood connections, right, to get you a series or an option or something like that. So I fired my agent, and I'm going to probably do a lot of self-publishing in the future.
I think that's a very enticing prospect for a lot of young writers and students. And we try to prepare them in the MFA for the realities of self-publishing and marketing and all that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, I think it's one thing to sort of learn about this stuff in an academic setting and have the resources at hand, but quite another to actually try to put it into practice with your own book, right? Because it matters whether you succeed or fail.
Right.
And what advice do you have, like in a practical manner, for somebody who wants to kind of explore self-publishing? Is there a way they can do it without, putting all their eggs in that basket and risking, the success of a book that they might have labored on for many, many years?
So the two pieces of advice I always give for self-publishing: have your book professionally edited, because if you get that thing out there, and there are, every book has a typo or two, right? And that's fine. But if you haven't had it edited, if you just had, oh, my brother read it and he thought it was great, so I'm going to publish it. Well, that's not editing. So I always have my work professionally edited.
And I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but do you mean like you would hire like a developmental editor to work on it, a line editor, or do you mean like a copy editor?
So I have a couple freelance editors I work with, and they kind of touch on a little bit of everything. They'll do some line editing, but if they start to see like a repeated issue, like word echoes or something in your formatting or something like that, they'll just stop line editing for that specific thing and just say, you need to go find the rest of these. And I'm okay with that, because they're trying to make a living too, and they're not making a ton of money editing. But they've also been in the business long enough, and in the horror specific genre long enough, to understand character development and story development, and they do give you feedback at least on developmental ideas that might make your story better. And the second thing is hire a good cover artist. Don't go out there and Photoshop and think you can do it yourself, because you can't. And the old thing about nobody judges a book by its cover is completely false. Everybody judges every book by its cover, so you've got to have a good cover. But yeah, I think 10 years ago, self-publishing had a big stigma attached to it, where it was like, you're self-publishing because you can't get your book published anywhere else. And that is so not true anymore. It's just a better opportunity to not share the profits with a publisher who may or may not be doing anything to help you. So right. I've kind of flipped 180 on that. 10 years ago, I would have said I'll never self-publish, but it's changed so much. And I've had a couple bad experiences with indie publishers who just, they're not doing their share of the work that they've committed to. Like, I've written the book and I've done what I'm supposed to do, and they're supposed to do their stuff and they're not. So I think self-publishing is a perfectly respectable and admirable way to go, if especially if you don't want to go through all the drama of querying, and it's a waiting game. I mean, a lot of these indie publishers they want you to only submit to their open call, and then they want you to wait 6 months to hear if you're going to get in or not. And that 6 months as a writer is a long time to be waiting when you want to get your work out there. So,
And I mean, even if your work is accepted, it might be a year or two before
oh,
it
absolutely.
sees print.
Absolutely. I still have The Clearing was a 3-book deal with the publisher, so I have the second book in with them now, waiting for their edits, and I owe them a third book, but I already know the second book isn't going to be out until 2025, even though I
Yeah.
finished it early this year. And
Wow.
so yeah, it's hard. Like Tom Petty said, the waiting is the hardest part. It really is. As
Wait,
introverted as a lot of writers are, once they type the end, they want that thing out there. They want people to read it, and it's hard. It really is hard. And when you have an avenue like self-publishing where you can kind of, I don't want to call it a shortcut, but take a different path and get it out there on your time frame, it's viable. And I'm a big supporter of it now. It's come a long way since the early days of Kindle,
yeah.
for sure.
But I think that for some people, I mean, you mentioned that a lot of writers are introverts, and I think there's that aspect of a writer's personality, and I agree with you. I think many writers are introverts. But then to be a successful marketer, you have to really kind of adopt a different kind of persona, don't you?
You do it, and that's the perfect word for it, because I tell my wife all the time, like, I'll go to these conventions, and they'll have it. If I have a dealer room, I'll have my table set up with all my books, and I have to put on my salesman hat, and it's very difficult for me to self promote. I'm not the kind of person that says, "Hey, my book is great, go buy it." Like, I almost feel weird talking about my own work, so it's very much a persona I have to put on when I'm at these events, to not be my normal self and try to be more self-promoting. And I tell my wife all the time, these events I'm exhausted. It takes a lot out of me to wear that salesman hat and try to promote myself. And but it is, in today's world, it's what you have to do. It's I hate to tell all the students this, but it's hard to be a writer and expect to make a career out of it, I guess. I do it because I love it. If I had to rely on it to pay the bills, I couldn't do it.
I think that's true for most writers. I mean, I
Most
think it's
writers, and probably most artists in any
yeah.
format, whether it's music or art, painting, drawing, whatever. It's tough.
Yeah, I remember when I was studying to be a writer and everything. I had a kind of a mean instructor who told me, don't quit your day job. But uh, nowadays, I think like, well, I shouldn't quit my day job. I mean, it's good to have a day job.
It is, right? Back to the first story I told about my high school English teacher. I never forgot about her, and the comment she put on my paper. And a few years after Haven came out, I said, I really want to look her up and, like, just find her and say thank you, even though I didn't act on her words when I should have. I never forgot those words. And when I finally tracked her down, she had already passed away at a
Oh
young
gosh.
age. But when I posted it I grew up in Malden, Massachusetts, so there's a Facebook group for Malden, and I posted this long thing, basically the story I told you about how much she inspired me and tried to motivate me. And some of her family members reached out to me and said, thank you so much for posting
Oh,
this.
that's
And I sent
great.
them some books. It was really, so if you have that teacher out there or that person that's inspiring you and trying to help you, just say thank you before it's too late.
Yeah. Yeah, I was lucky enough when my first book came out, I tracked down one of my high school English teachers, and,
Yep.
and she was still alive, and I sent her a copy of it. I don't know what she made of it. I mean, she was very, very gratified though that I had taken the writing path.
I wish I had the chance to thank her, so that's great to hear.
Yeah. Folks, we're coming to the end of our chat, so I just want to ask for any last questions. We have time, I think, for at least one more question. If anybody has anything they'd like to ask, just type it in the chat. And so here's one. What is your favorite place you've gone to for inspiration?
Oh, there's so many. I've already mentioned a couple, the Stanley and Waverly Hills. Salem, Massachusetts, that you mentioned at the beginning, is just, it's an endless supply of inspiration. I've been to Alcatraz, which is another amazing place to spend time and get motivated. I don't know. There's been so many places. There's for those of you who don't know Arizona, there's a place in Arizona called Sedona, which is it's sort of a modern day kind of hippie community almost, but it's some of the most beautiful setting you'll ever see. It's where all the Red Rock canyons are and things like that. But they also have 7 vortexes, and a vortex is allegedly, and again, maybe it's kind of a hippie thing, maybe it's not. A vortex is a place where there's a lot of positive energy supposed to be. So you'll go to these hikes, and the vortexes are somewhere along these hikes, and you'll find, just people sitting there meditating and, just kind of chilling out. And I have been to, I think, 3 or 4 of them while we were out there. And I do believe there's something to them. I went to one of these vortexes and I just kind of sat down. This one had a little river running by it, and we just sat down, and I started having all these like memories of things that happened in my childhood that I hadn't really thought of since I was a kid. So it was the closest thing, I think, to a supernatural experience I've ever had, just because these memories just came like so vivid out of the blue. So I do believe there's something to these vortexes. So if you're into any of that stuff, go to Sedona, Arizona. It's a really cool throwback little town. There's like crystal shops everywhere, and it's just, but it's some of the most beautiful scenery you'll ever see in this country.
And let me ask one last question. Let's see if I can find it here. Here it is. What was the most helpful critique or critical guidance that you received from anyone?
So I usually answer this question kind of in the opposite, and I will tell you the least helpful and try to make that into something helpful. So there's this kind of mantra out there, like, writers write every day. You have to write every day if you're a writer. And that really put me off for a lot of years because I believed it, and you get to a point where if you don't write for 2 days, you're like, see, I'm not a writer. I can't do this. I'm not writing every day. I think the write every day advice that a lot of writers have probably already heard is the worst writing advice. You have to find your own process. You have to find what works for you. I definitely would agree, write as much as you can, but I'm a runner as well, so I kind of compare it to exercise. Like if you wanted to get in shape and somebody said you have to go running every day, you're gonna quickly realize that some days you just can't do it, and you're not gonna do it. But that doesn't mean you should quit, and you should just keep going. Yeah, I don't know. That's probably the other piece of advice I will say. which has helped me a lot, is whatever genre you're writing in, read everything. Read outside the genre. Read, thrillers, mysteries, nonfiction, romance, whatever, because there's great writing out there in other genres other than what you're interested in. And there's always little things you can pick up from those other genres too. So I kind of read everything now, which is something I never used to do when I was younger.
That's great advice. I actually have a poster of a framed poster of William Faulkner on my wall that just says exactly that. Read everything.
Yep.
So
I'm always amazed, like when we do our bios, the first week of class, and the class introduces themselves and do bios, and some of them, I don't read that much, and I'm like, okay, yeah. That's interesting. I'm not going to say anything, but you should be reading if you want to be a writer. Sorry, it's part of the game.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I mean that's another topic that we could talk a lot more about. I know. But we've come to the end of our time. Tom, I want to thank you so much. And Melissa, you've just been incredible with throwing all this stuff into the chat. It's amazing.
Yeah,
so thank you. Thank you as well. And I wish you all the best on your travels, Tom. And do you have anything you want to plug? Anything coming out now or in the near future or anything?
The next thing coming out for me is going to be my first real full-length novel ghost story called Those Left Behind. It's with my editor now, and I am going to go ahead and self-publish this one. I have a cover artist in mind for it that I've been talking to. So that's probably going to be out February timeframe, and it will be self-published. The other big news that nobody knows about, so I'm announcing it here for the first time, is I'm editing an anthology that I came up with the concept for, and it's exactly the memory I told you of when I found that Salem's Lot book on that little spinny rack. So I don't know if you're familiar with Grady Hendrix' Paperbacks from Hell. Grady Hendrix is a horror writer, and he wrote this nonfiction book called Paperbacks from Hell, and it's a look back at all the kind of pulpy looking mass market paperbacks that were out in the 70s and 80s, and he does like a whole almost theatrical presentation of it. He sings and everything. He's a riot. Look him up if you ever can. But I wanted to publish an anthology that had that same feel to all the books I grew up reading. So I went out and invited as many of my friends that are big name that I can think of to get out there. And I went out, I managed to finagle a Stephen King contact through my contact. So I'm going to have a reprint of Stephen King's The Raft.
Oh, that's awesome.
As part of this anthology. So that's going to be coming out probably next summer. And it's going to be all of today's stars in Johnny Compton, Richard Chismar, a whole host of others, and I haven't announced this anywhere, so all my friends are going to be yelling at me now if they hear this. If I didn't invite them, but yeah,
fantastic.
I'm super excited. I've edited an anthology before. I'm really excited for it, so I think it's going to be fun.
Well, stay in touch with me and let me know when it's coming out and everything.
Absolutely.
And on that note, I am going to bid everyone a fond good night, and we'll see you in December for the next Wireside chat.
Thank you again. Appreciate you having me. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.